We're speaking today with Martin Kenyon, a research fellow at Wharton, about the news this week that CEOs at the largest U.S. companies saw their pay jump on average about 11% to about 9.3 million, and that's according to a survey sponsored by the Wall Street Journal. In 2009, CEOs got no raise at all, and these figures apply to 2010. So tell me, is the era of big CEO pay back? Because in addition to that, we had Philippe Damon of Viacom earning $86 million, or double his pay from last year, which tends to be what folks focus on.
Right. So there are a couple of important issues that we can raise there. First, it does seem that CEO compensation, according to this survey, has increased by approximately 10% in the fiscal year 2010. I think one of the important points and one of the comforting elements that comes out of this survey is that although we've seen pay increase, we've also seen the performance of these firms increase too. The same survey shows that sort of corporate profits have increased by about 18%, 19%, and similarly stockholder returns have increased by about the same amount. So in terms of whether CEOs have earned this extra compensation, this growth in pay of about 10%, we do seem to be seeing a link here between the compensation received by CEOs and the performance of their firms, which in that sense is comforting and is part of the good news of this survey.
On the other hand, overall wages and salaries in the U.S. actually dropped by 1% over the calendar year. And so maybe that raises the question, did the improved corporate performances, did that come through shrinkage and layoffs and becoming more efficient, or how much was attributed to top-line growth?
Right. Well, for sure, the determination of executive compensation is a reasonably complex issue. The evidence seems to suggest that compensation of CEOs is correlated to the growth in their corporate size, corporate value, and this is a good thing. Like all factors of production within the firm, there's going to be a myriad of factors which are going to determine the level of pay received by CEOs or other individuals within firms. I think one of the encouraging factors that's arrived on the corporate governance landscape in the last couple of years is the Dodd-Frank Act. And as part of the Dodd-Frank Act, one of the things that we're going to see is even more transparency and disclosure of executive compensation and other compensation matters. Specifically, companies are going to start revealing how much they're paying their typical employees. They're going to be explaining how much their CEOs are receiving, and in consequence, investors, the media, the public are going to be able to see much more the relation between CEO pay and typical workers within the firm over time.
We've gotten used to hearing that statistic that 20 years ago or 30 years ago, typical CEO pay was about 50 times or so more than their average employee, and now it's 400 or 500. So that's the ratio that they'll be looking at?
Right. I'm not sure whether there is an ideal or an optimal ratio here. Like many factors of production, it's not clear why you would necessarily want to benchmark one particular individual against another individual, but it's a useful thing to know about in the wider scheme of things. Shareholders, when they're trying to design compensation policies, must try and find an optimal compensation package that recruits, retains, and motivates a CEO. In that context, if we think about the CEO labour market in recent years becoming more global, that CEOs are having to run increasingly complex enterprises, that might be part of the explanation why CEO compensation is increasing at a faster rate than other employees within the firm. There is no easy answer to this, but the goal of a compensation policy must be to sort of try and find the right set of instruments that aligns the CEO's interests with those of shareholders. And I think this is, as I looked at the results of this survey in the Wall Street Journal, there were some other encouraging factors there. It is true that the level of compensation has increased over time. But one of the interesting features about this study is the amount of pay that is at risk for the CEO. So if one was to look at the salary element only, so this is the cash compensation that's guaranteed to the CEO, and then...
What's on their W-2?
It's other things as well, but in addition to just the salary, these the CEOs are receiving annual incentive plans, which tend to be related to the budgeted performance of the company, stock options, restricted stock, and other equity awards. So if we would take the whole package together, this is the number that we're seeing, which was about $9–10 million. But the salary element of that is only probably about 15 to 20% on average. So 4/5 of the CEO's compensation is at risk in the sense that it's contingent upon the performance of the firm. If the firms don't perform well in the future, those elements won't pay off, and the CEO won't be receiving those kinds of compensation benefits.
Have there been any major changes that would shift or encourage CEOs to do more long-term planning rather than short-term quarter-by-quarter planning where their compensation might be more on the line?
Yeah, so the governance of executive compensation is often shifting, and there can always be improvements in the way that we can structure compensation. So, for example, compensation arrangements can actually be explicitly made performance contingent. So one can say these payouts of these equity awards are contingent upon achieving particular hurdles. And in that sense, actually, European firms, publicly traded firms in the United Kingdom, do make the award of compensation components contingent upon the achievement of various EPS targets or total shareholder return targets that beat the market. So these are relative performance measures. In the United States, again, with the passage of Dodd-Frank, we are seeing much more accountability and much more transparency, even compared to a very high level of transparency and accountability that existed in the United States already. But I think some of the additional elements, and I think this goes back to your original question about is the era of big CEO pay back? Well, maybe, but with the passage of Dodd-Frank, what we're seeing is now shareholders are going to be able to vote on the compensation packages received by CEOs, and presumably boards of directors, compensation committees, CEOs themselves will have an eye to what shareholders are going to think about this when they come to vote on these matters in the future. And perhaps if one thought that compensation packages were a little on the high side, this would tend to have a dampening effect on compensation going forward. So my guess is that when 2011 rolls around and the same survey is done again next year, I suspect we won't see quite the same increase that we saw this year.
That's an interesting lever for shareholders. What about employees? How does it change the culture of a company when the CEO in the company earns $86 million?
On the one hand, we can see sort of high levels of compensation as a goal to which employees might aspire. And in that sense, we might think of it as a potentially motivating device. However, on the other hand, we know that if the differences become too big, this can actually demotivate sort of employees. And so there isn't a really clear-cut answer to sort of what the overall effect is going to be on the morale, if you like, the performance consequences of employees. We know that there is some evidence to suggest that employees, when they receive stock-based compensation and equity payments, tend to see that as a good thing in the sense that it creates an extra kick in their sort of motivation, and in consequence we see those kinds of companies which are spreading the rewards sort of doing better than those companies who are less likely to do it.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you very much. Pleasure.